Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Adobe Naobi, the Marketing and Research Associate at BookNet. Welcome to Audiobooks for Everyone, an accessibility-first approach. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote, and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities and all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. If during the presentation you have questions, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Cassie Smyth is the Audiobooks Manager at ECW Press. In her role, she has managed the production of more than 350 audiobooks, all by Canadian publishers and authors, and narrated by Canadian voice talent. She holds a BA in English, minor in business from Carleton University, and a certificate in creative book publishing from Humber College. Over to you, Cassie.
Thanks so much, Adobe. Thanks for having me. Thank you everyone for coming to my webinar, Audiobooks for Everyone, an Accessibility First Approach. My name is Cassie Smyth, and I am the Audiobooks Manager at ECW Press. I have been in this role for the last 4.5 years, and in this role, I specifically work on audiobook production, meaning everything from final pages of a manuscript to final files of an audiobook. Unfortunately, I'm not able to speak to distribution or metadata in its entirety, but if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me after the presentation, and I'd be happy to consult with my colleagues about anything to do with that. So to get started, our agenda today, we will be going over an overview of ECW Press's audiobook program and how we got to where we are today. Then I'm going to do a deep dive into accessibility best practices and considerations when it comes to audiobook production. And to round it all off, I'm then going to do a quick overview of CELA's Accessible Commercial Audiobooks Research Project, which I had the pleasure of being a part of their advisory committee last year and overseeing their work. The full report will be available as part of the links after this tech forum today. To give a little bit of background about ECW's audiobook program, we got into this work in 2015. We are turning 51 years old this year, but we've been in the audiobook game for about 10 years. And when we first delved into this sphere, it was because our co-publisher, David Caron, looked around at the audiobook industry in Canada and what other Canadian publishers were doing and realized that almost all of us were licensing out to American audiobook publishers or just not creating audiobooks to start with. And we have so many wonderful studios in Canada. We have such fantastic vocal talent. We have fantastic directors. We have such a wealth of talent north of the border. And why weren't we taking advantage of it? And so, in the 10 years since then, very exciting that we're coming up on 10 years of this audiobook work, we have produced over 650 audiobooks. That's an average of 65 per year. We're very proud of it. Now, this isn't saying that we produced 65 audiobooks each and every year. We have had busy years and we have had less busy years. At our peak, whenever the Canada Book Fund was offering the accessible audiobooks funding, we were producing north of 120 audiobooks each year. Thank you, Kathy. But now we're maybe more between 30 and 50, but we're still going strong. We're still really dedicated to having audiobook representation for our books and our client publishers' books. And we think this is really important work to continue on and to create this community of audiobooks in Canada. As I mentioned, we work with client publishers at ECW on, thank you so much, Jenny. It's so nice you're here. But we work with several different Canadian publishers. It's not just ECW's own frontlist titles. As you'll notice, I mentioned we do 120 plus audiobooks some years in production. We at ECW, we publish around 50 titles as our front list each year. So that math simply does not work. We also have our bespoke audio editions imprint, in which we acquire the audio license from other Canadian publishers to produce those audiobooks under this imprint. You'll know Arsenal Pulp Presses, Butter Honey Pig Bread, or the Invisible Books, The Clarion. We produce both of these under our bespoke imprint. As for our client publishers, we've been really lucky to form great relationships with a bunch of Canadian publishers. Here is just a small selection of the publishers that we've worked with. But I just wanted to grab these to kind of demonstrate the variety of material that we've had the pleasure to work on. We've worked with Between the Lines and University of Regina Press, McGill Queen's University Press, Goose Lane, University of Manitoba Press, Vacule, all of these different publishers offering all of these different books, different genres, different accessible material to work with. So we've really run the gamut of everything and anything that we can possibly encounter in the audiobooks sphere and figured out how to adapt that to audio in a way that is accessible and enjoyable. So I'm going to dive into audiobook accessibility best practices next. I've divvied this up into 5 bits just because it seems the best way to kind of dive into each and every one of these different silos. We're going to talk about adapting books to accessible audiobooks and the kinds of books that need these accessibility considerations more than others. Then we'll dive into different types of accessible material. So we're talking footnotes, endnotes, bibliographies, works cited, images, graphs, tables, figures, and so on. All of those and how we take those and present them in audio in a way that is accessible. Then I'll touch briefly on supplemental PDFs and what that can mean whenever you're distributing an audiobook. You can prepare that to go along with your files. Then, of course, I'll touch on AI a little bit because it is a hot button issue that we are just delving more and more into every single day, it seems. Then I will touch on ACX standards, which is a little bit more technical, and how to enhance navigability in very simple ways for your audiobook. Okay, so first up, we have adapting books to accessible audiobooks. While audiobooks are generally accessible by nature, just in the fact that they are audio, so they are um, easier for those with print disabilities to listen to, and it's great that they have this medium to hear the book instead of being able to read it from print. It is not necessarily the case that all books will be made into accessible audiobooks. I've had a few books that I've read in my personal reading where I've read through the whole thing in audio. It's been great. And then I pick it up in a store and I realize that there were a bunch of images throughout that simply were not incorporated into the audiobook. And that's something that not that I necessarily would require the accessibility considerations, I would have liked to have known that they were there so that I could enjoy the full picture of the audiobook. So there are certain genres that we find these considerations come more into play with, and those are children's literature, of course, full of images, picture books by nature, full of images by the title itself. Then nonfiction, where we're dealing with maybe footnotes, endnote, those heavy bibliographies, as well as memoirs or business titles. These are more the kinds of books that you will need to make accessibility considerations for. So, when I talk about types of accessible material, I'm going to break it down into three categories that we are typically looking at whenever we go to prepare an audiobook script. So, first of all, we have footnotes and endnotes, then we have images, and then works cited, bibliography, and references. We can kind of lump them into these three categories and how we deal with them. First, I'm going to pull an example from The Monster in the Mirror by KJ Aiello. This is a memoir and cultural criticism that connects popular fantasy with our perceptions of mental illness. It has tons of footnotes in it. And when we were going through here this script, we really wanted to make sure that this information was not lost because it is so integral to the book. Um, so what we decided, because the footnotes were more of a bibliographic entry nature, was to separate them out into a file towards the end of the audiobook. So they wouldn't interrupt listener experience, but they were still present in the audiobook. Um, so in the main body of the book, the text reads as, if my audio...
Frankenstein's monster is the epitome of speaking something into existence. Abracadabra, I create as I speak. And no one.
So that's how it appears in the audiobook. And then I've pulled a snippet from the footnotes file at the end of the book for you, so you can hear what that would look like audibly.
Endnotes. Chapter 1, The Monster and the Mirror. 1. Julian Sinclair, Abracadabra, The Jewish Chronicle, July 5th, 2018, www.thejc.com/judaism/Jewish-words/abracadabra-1.466709.
So that is including the footnote as accessible material. Now, to address the elephant in the room, you'll notice that the original narrator, who is the author, KJ Aiello, is not the same as the bibliographic content. And this kind of leads into our conversation about AI that I'll touch on later. I believe, to my knowledge, that ECW has incorporated AI in their audiobook, or synthetic voice, as some people call it, twice. And this has solely been for accessibility considerations to record this back matter where a narrator is unable to do so. For us, it is a matter of like we have received recommendations from Sela and from Nels that it is more important to have this accessible material in the audiobook than to not have it. And so we have made informed decisions about how best we can go about this and still fulfill our requirements to have the accessibility material in the audiobook. And in a case where a narrator is unable to narrate it themselves, we have opted twice to use a synthetic voice just for for the accessible material, not for the main narrative, not for the main text, but just to make sure that this accessible material is incorporated and is present in the audiobook. Okay, next I will move on to images. So, what better book, in my opinion, to talk about images than Denison Avenue by Christina Wong and Daniel Innes? We released this in spring 2023, and it went on to be shortlisted for Canada Reads. we are so proud of it because of how unique it is. I actually have it here with me today, and you can see it right here. And for those who don't know or aren't familiar with it, if you open it from one side, we have a novel. We have written text. There's a little bit of variation in how the text is formatted with italics or being written out like this, kind of like a poem. But it's just text. It's just text. But if you flip it over like this, then it's a graphic novel. And you can read it from the entire other side. So that all of these illustrations are done by Daniel Innes, and all of the text is done by Christina Wong. And so we had originally decided not to produce this audiobook because it's such a daunting prospect, right? Like half the book is images. And how were we going to go about that in a way that was intriguing and enticing to listeners when so much content is conveyed through those graphics and through those illustrations by Daniel? They're very beautiful. And we were approached by CNIB, who had received funding from DCH's image description program for accessible audiobooks, EPUBs, and Braille versions of graphic novels. And they asked us if we would be interested in creating an audiobook for Denison Avenue. And we said, of course, we love this book. We're very passionate about it. And so CNIB worked with the authors directly to create image alt text that almost created a behind the scenes experience for audiobook listeners, that you're getting a totally different experience than people reading the book off the page or reading the ebook. It's got so much depth of information in it from the author and the illustrator. And we thought this was a really compelling example of how you can adapt images for audio that isn't just plain image alt text where you're just conveying the facts of the scene. You're creating so much more depth of meaning and intrigue. So the image, I will play the image alt description for you in this audio clip. It is a little bit long, but it is the image that you see on the top right of my screen on this slide. And you can hear Christina describe it in her and Daniel's words.
1. The top panel shows a lush garden bordered by a chain link fence at the southeast corner of Denison Avenue and Wales Avenue. The vegetables grow taller than the fence, curling around their wooden supports, hanging sticks, and connecting ropes. Bricks lie across the length of the garden. The house's facade is made of bricks scored with mortar lines. A utility pole stands next to the garden in a small bed of grass. A stop sign and street sign that says Wales Avenue are affixed to it. Just above the street name, it says Kensington in a whimsical font. Posters are also taped around the bottom of the pole. The sidewalk in front has a few cracks where some weeds have managed to grow. The bottom panel centers on two 2.5-story semi-detached houses with pointed roofs, 157 and 155 Denison Avenue, nestled amid other 2-story homes. The two houses are nearly identical in appearance, with turret windows and diamond-shaped porch fences. Choi Sum hunches over a shopping cart on the porch of 157. The front garden is full and plentiful, with tall vegetable plants supported by slanted poles and lattices. Poles and sticks are piled on the right side of the garden, next to a bicycle. A concrete path divides the garden and leads to a chain link gate, which fences off the yard. Shrubs grow in the garden of 155, at the foot of a lone tall tree scored with grooves. A utility pole rises out of the sidewalk in front of the houses. Wrapped around it are a no parking sign with a crossed out octagon and another sign that reads maximum 30. Illustrator's note. This is an homage to the many front yard Chinese vegetables gardens found throughout Chinatown and Kensington Market. What Christina and I love about these gardens is their visibility and their unabashedly resourcefulness, repurposing mop and broom handles, old pipes, and hockey sticks for makeshift trellises and support, or their use of old tofu buckets and styrofoam boxes as planters. They also remind Christina of her own late grandmother's garden when she was growing up.
So there we have an example of an image description. That doesn't have to just be plain and simple and cut dry. It can be a little bit more illustrative, a little bit more depth of emotion or heart or feeling, to really entice listeners everyday listeners, as well as people who would need the image alt text. Next up, and last on the list of these three different types of accessible material, is works cited bibliography and references. For nonfiction and memoirs, there is frequently some reference back matter for us to contend with. We usually just have this narrated where it appears in the final pages of the manuscript, so this will be towards the end of the book. And here is an example from Ruby Smith Diaz's Searching for Seraphim.
Bibliography. Compton, Wade. After Canaan, Essays on Race, Writing and Region. Vancouver, Arsenal Pub Press, 2010. Matthews, James Skit, Compiler. Conversations with Catalano, 1932 to 1954. Vancouver, Talon Books, 2022. Originally published by City of Vancouver Archives in 1955. Matthews, James Skit. Early Vancouver, Volume 4. Vancouver, City of Vancouver, 1944. 2011.
As you can hear, this kind of material is very involved to record, with each symbol having to be narrated. It takes, on average, 2 to 3 times longer to record this kind of material. This involved like HTML links, and so on, than it does just your regular narrative text that you would find in the main body of the audiobook. So it's very time consuming, but it's very important to make sure that this is included in the audiobook for accessibility purposes. Moving on now to talk about supplemental PDFs. This is an option that not every audiobook retailer can accommodate, but Audible is one of the ones that I have confirmed, and I believe that there's a handful of other ones. It's just I'm not on the distribution side, so I can't speak to the exact ones. But in some select cases, some retailers will accept a supplemental PDF to accompany, the audiobook files. And so what this is, it's just a PDF. It just has your title of the book, your copyright page, and then any pages in the book that have images on them. So you can see from this excerpt of Rick Emmett's 10 Telecaster Tales, it has some very beautiful illustrations within it. And so what we've done is just strip out those images and put them in a PDF, and then these are included and sent out to Audible and the other retailers that can accommodate this. Sorry, I can't speak to them off the top of my head. So that anyone who wants to see the images for themselves can just download the PDF and look at it. This is not something that I would recommend to replace image alt text. It is simply to complement it. It's just if you want to go a step further and be a little bit more thorough, you can explore this option as well. Now moving on to AI and audiobooks. It is such a hot button issue in the audiobook sphere, and the main topic of concern is obviously if human narrators will be eventually replaced by synthetic and AI narrators. And let me just say off the hop that that is not something that we're interested in at ECW Press. We do not believe that a synthetic voice can carry the same nuance and heart as a human voice does. All of our productions are narrated by human narrators. But as we saw earlier, there is a use case for synthetic voices when it comes to specific scenarios, such as if a narrator is unavailable to narrate that back matter, let's say a bibliography where it's 20 pages of HTML or of links, apologies, or really dense bibliographic entries. If they're not available for that, and the option is either not including that and not having that accessibility, or including it with a synthetic voice, we opt to include it for accessibility purposes, and AI is the way that we can get about this. As I mentioned, we've only done this on 2 occasions, but every other occasion we've had the same material narrated by a human narrator. It's nice that we're able to have a backup if all else fails and we don't have that narrator available to narrate the accessible material, but our first choice is always to have everything narrated by a human narrator. The benefits, of course, as I mentioned on the last slide or 2 slides ago with searching for Seraphim, is that material is very dense to record. It's a lot of effort for the human narrator. It's a really time consuming. It takes maybe 2 to 3 times as long as just normal text in the studio to record that. That's 2 to 3 times more of the narrator's time, 2 to 3 times more of the studio time. And so I can see an argument where synthetic voice for accessible material is an affordable option. It's an interesting argument to make. It's interesting to see where our future might lead with this, but at present, ECW is firmly on the side of human creators. Moving on to ACX standards. For those who don't know, ACX stands for Audiobook Creation Exchange. This is a platform developed by Audible that facilitates the creation and distribution of audiobooks. Most often, they act as a marketplace where authors can find narrators and studios that will produce their audiobooks. As such, ACX has created technical standards for audiobooks that have now been adopted industry-wide. And this gets a little bit technical, but please bear with me on the next slide. We just have a few technical specifications. These include an opening and closing credits file. We want to say, like, this is the title of the audiobook. It's written by this person. It's narrated by this person. In the first file so that people know what they're getting into. And we also want a closing credits that gives credit where credit is due for the author, that acknowledges the copyright, and lets the listener know that the audiobook is coming to an end. Audible and other retailers also ask for a retail sample to be submitted. This is just usually the first chapter. Each file should be no longer than 120 minutes and split longer sections into separate files. That just means you cut it at an appropriate time. You just take the chapter title again, put it in there, and then put a continued or something like that, and then start up the remaining bits of the chapter. You should include one section or chapter per file, meaning we're not putting 3 chapters in one file. We don't want the listener to get confused. We should label files with a chapter or section title, which I'll dive into a little bit more on the next slide. Files, this is really technical, should be in mono or stereo. Volume should be at a certain level. Peak levels should be at a certain level. Noise floor should be at a certain level. And the room tone should be less than 5 seconds at any time. This just means there should be no pauses longer than 5 seconds. So, enhancing navigability. What we do at ECW Press and what's a best practice overall in the industry is to provide a manifest to retailers that allows end users to better navigate the audiobook. So you'll see on the right where it says no manifest. This is an example of an audiobook where a manifest was not provided. So you'll see it just shows up chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc. And these are all, as you can see on the left, different files. One's the opening credit, the next is the epigraph, and then we have 1 papyrus, 2 Herculaneum, and so on. We want to make sure that listeners navigating the audiobook know where they are at any given time, can jump from a file to another file, especially like let's say in nonfiction. This is an example from a fiction title, but let's say in nonfiction, a collection of essays. If someone wants to jump from one specific essay to another one that is labeled and piques their interest, we want them to know where those files are, and to be able to do that. So this is just a very simple way that we can make sure that listeners can get where they want to go. Okay, moving on, and the last thing I'll talk about today is CELA's Accessible Commercial Audiobooks Research Report. So last year, CELA, the Center for Equitable Library Access, applied to and received a grant from Accessibility Standards Canada to research commercial audiobooks in Canada and how they can be standardized and made accessible across the board. This resulted in the following research project and findings. I had the honor to serve on the advisory committee for this project and watch the development of this project through its many stages. So a little bit of background. CELA created the Commercial Audiobooks Research Project to investigate and address accessibility gaps in the commercial audiobook production for individuals with print disabilities. While digital publishing has advanced accessibility, particularly with ebooks, commercial audiobooks still lack standardized accessibility practices despite being a primary reading format for many. The goal of the research project was to provide recommendations to commercial audiobook producers and publishers and other stakeholders to improve the accessibility of audiobooks for individuals with print disabilities. As for the methodology of the research report, CELA consulted scholarly literature and publishing standards, end users of commercial audiobooks, nonprofit organizations supporting individuals with print disabilities, and publishers, producers, and industry stakeholders. Moving on to some key findings from their report. They found that commercial audiobooks currently lack standardized accessibility features. Each producer or each publisher is kind of making it up as they go and not necessarily speaking with each other and talking about the best ways that we can address accessibility and integrate it into our production workflows. Many commercial audiobooks omit front and back matter, like I mentioned earlier, leaving listeners, especially those who rely entirely on audio formats, at a disadvantage in accessing full content. As for user habits and preferences, there was a case made for born accessible audiobooks. This would include shared preferences for accessibility features such as better navigation, image descriptions, high quality narration, and metadata, enhancing usability for everyone by implementing features like navigable tables of contents, properly structured chapters, and descriptions for images. And there was a demand for customized experiences tailored to each user, no matter what their needs may be. The audiobook industry needs greater collaboration on accessibility. Like I mentioned, a lot of us are just doing the best we can with what we know and what feedback we get, but we do much better to get everyone in a room and talk about how we can best address the needs of our listeners going forward. As for the report, they had some key findings and key recommendations for publishers and producers. The first key recommendations across the board for different groups, I'll say, but I'll start with publishers and producers. They recommend that all book elements are included in the audiobook and to avoid abridgment. They recommended to provide supplemental materials, whether that be in the supplemental PDF that I mentioned earlier or otherwise, to use clear, well-paced narration with explicit cues for footnotes, image descriptions, and headings, and to provide a detailed, accessible table of contents using track lists and name files meaningfully, harkening back to our manifest that we talked about earlier. Then they provided recommendations for audiobook platforms and libraries to build platforms that support end-to-end accessibility, including voice commands and customizable settings, to develop reading technologies that allow customization and support further accessibility features and flexibility, to prioritize accessibility in the procurement of digital resources, to offer diverse audiobook collections, and provide training on digital literacy and accessible services. And last, we have some industry-wide recommendations to explore advanced features like AI-driven bookmarking, summarization, and voice-activated commands, to develop and adopt common accessibility metadata and standards, to explore technological solutions to allow readers to customize their experience, to work towards allowing synchronized text and audiobooks to enhance compatibility with assistive tools and respond to reader preferences generally. If you're interested in reading more about their research project, they have a very comprehensive report that goes into their methodology, into their findings, and really dives into everyone that they spoke with and compiles all of their research beautifully. That will be, yeah, Natalie just linked it in the chat that everyone can go read about it in their own time. And that is it from me today. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate you being here and listening. I hope this was a helpful discussion of accessibility and audiobooks that you can integrate into your company practices going forward.
Thanks for a very informative presentation, Cassie.
Thanks so much, Adobe.
Yeah. It's time for the Q&A portion of the session. So we have quite a bit of questions from the chat and the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with the first one. What is the user experience like for listeners with footnotes or endnotes? Specifically, how do listeners jump from the flow of the text to the endnote content if endnotes are placed after the chapter or at the end of the book?
So this is one of those instances where we are a little bit siloed between producers, distributors, and platforms that listeners would listen on. This is something that we would rely on the technology of a platform to be able to do, and they have not created that yet, where we're able to jump to a certain mark in an audiobook. I believe the technology exists in ebook. I'm sorry, I don't work in ebook, so that's not something I can speak to entirely, but there's no way to link from one place in an audiobook to another where you can just jump automatically. Sadly, that accessibility does not exist yet, so the best we can do is just to include it all and not hope for the best, but include it all for accessibility purposes. It is not a perfect system yet. There are still so many developments to be made in audiobooks. This is just one where we're waiting for the technology to catch up.
Okay. Next question. Cassie, how are you able to decide how much emotional description to add to the image descriptions? Often I'm asked to just describe the image without the emotionally descriptive additions.
I think it depends on the book, depends on the author, depends on the publisher. De yeah, it depends on a whole bunch of factors. I think each and every production, I always say in my line of work, every book is different. We've got a different narrator, different director, different studio, different this, different that. Every situation is entirely unique. So I think it's a real case by case basis, which I know is not a very helpful answer. But I think asking those key questions and communicating with the producer or the publisher or whoever you're working with could be helpful to kind of suss out whether that might be an appropriate situation to add a little bit more emotion or a little bit more depth to it.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's also different depending on the type of book you're working with.
Exactly.
Children's book versus memoir.
Yeah, or versus business book where you're describing a table or figures or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We work a lot with scholarly books. How would you handle charts and tables?
Alt text, 100%. It depends on where, first of all, I would make sure that the paragraphs preceding and afterwards, but that, okay, let me backtrack, sorry. That the figure does not appear in the middle of a paragraph, that you want to insert the alt text for it between paragraphs so you don't interrupt flow for the listener in the middle of a sentence. You really want to make sure that it fits in there nicely. I alt text is the way to do it. We worked on The Rule of 30 by Frederick Vatisse, and it's complicated alt text to describe a graph to someone audibly, but it can be done. It's just tough. But I would say that a supplemental PDF can go a long way for books like that, as the chat pointed out. So thank you
Yeah,
for that.
I definitely look that as well. Yeah. And in the supplemental PDF, like you said, all text, it would also
Yes.
be required.
Yeah, both of them, and your goal in. One or the other. Better have image alt text than a supplemental PDF, I would say. Supplemental PDF is just a helping hand to the alt text.
Yes. Is the manifest included within the metadata, or is it a separate file like a CSV that accompanies the audio files?
Unfortunately, my limited understanding of distribution, because our my colleague Jessica Albert does such fantastic work. I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that it's something that I prepare and I send to her that is separate from the regular metadata. I don't know if she then incorporates it into the metadata, but I do know that the form I send to her is separate.
Okay. With things like picture books, would you include cover descriptions, often a copy of an interior illustration, and more boring stuff like the copyright page?
So the copyright can just be put in the end credits. Generally, you can just say this book was written by this person, copyright is held by this person, who the illustrator is, etc. So the copyright is quite straightforward, and that goes at the end of the book. It doesn't have to go at the beginning, especially if we have kids listening to it. They'll probably get distracted and veer off if the copyright is right at the top of the book. As for the cover, it's totally up to the publisher, I would say. We have had some productions where a publisher has wanted us to include the cover art description and like the interior pages. We have had some where the cover art is its own creature and they don't incorporate it. I I think it's good for accessibility, but also it's not something that we do as a regular practice. I don't think it hurts. Let's put it that way.
Um, Synthetic voice for bibliographic text. This is a great idea for text that is liable to have errors in the read. Example, long strings of numbers, symbols, etc. What do you use to create your synthetic voice?
Oh, we've used two companies. So, and like I said, we've done this twice. So I don't have a reliable one to refer to you to. I want to say that we used SpeechKey the first time, and then we worked with some company from Quebec. I can't remember for the second time. But if you email whoever this is, if you email me afterwards, my email's up on the PowerPoint screen. I'll track that down and I can get that information for you.
Great. Another question asks, I've produced accessible audiobooks before and had to sort through different standards set by NELS, CELA, and CNIB. Do you see CELA standards become the more dominant ones?
Our standards have been and like best practices have been developed under guidance of CLNLs and CNIB. I think how we've begun to go about things kind of incorporates everything from all of them, and I like to think makes everyone happy. I don't see one of them as the leader in it, and that their word is gospel and you should just refer to one of them. I think to refer to all of them and to try and make each like organization happy is to make the most accessible possible audiobook. Um,
That makes sense.
mhm.
Basically follow all the guidelines.
Yeah, there's a lot of guidelines, believe me.
Yeah. Um, what can I include in my table of contents to add value for the listener?
Okay, could I get a little clarification on if this is a narrated table of contents or if it's like the table of contents as would appear in like a like Audible or a Hoopla or something like that?
Let's see if they put in the comment to clarify.
I only ask just because we don't typically narrate table of contents in our audiobooks. But when it comes to the manifest, which I would also refer to like just myself as a table of contents, um, basically you just want to use those chapter headings as they would appear in your manuscript of your book. So if you had chapter 1, it all begins. You would want to include all of that in the table of contents as it would appear on the listener's platform so they can see that.
Okay.
Mhm.
And those are all our questions. Thank you again so much for joining us today, Cassie.
Thank you
Before
for
we
having
go,
me.
yes, we loved having you. Before we go, we'd love it if you could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. To our attendees, we invite you to join our upcoming session, Ready, Set, Go, Pre-Fall Sales Trends and Data-Driven Insights, scheduled for September 23rd. Find information about all upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website, bnctechforum.ca. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to you all for attending.